The Italians and Chinese are both well known for being involved in organized crime, especially in the United States. Both groups immigrated to the United States around the same time and often established communities next to each other in the big cities. They also brought with them the tradition of criminal secret societies. Despite this similar history and close proximity, collaboration between the two groups was mostly unheard of to the public. It's an often asked question if the Italian mafia and the Chinese Tongs or gangs ever did business together. However, information on this topic is rarely provided. But our researchers have dug up a story in which this rare collaboration took place. In this video, we will tell the never-before-told story of how the mafia linked up with the Tongs in the 1930s and how they secretly worked together for years to create a nationwide drug operation. As always, before diving into the full story, please consider hitting the like button to support ADB Crime Case. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified about our latest investigations. Now, let's begin. Before we get into the story, we have to start with describing the early history of the drug trade. First, let's explain what exactly opium is. Opium comes from the opium poppy plant, which historically was grown in Asia. The opium poppy plant oozes sap, which would then be scraped and air-dried to produce smokable opium. Opium is also used to create other hard drugs that we are familiar with, like morphine and heroin. Opium was a huge source of social, economic, and political controversy in Asia for centuries. Opium became most popular for use in China in the 1700s, due to the British flooding the region with Indian opium. The British policy created a situation of millions of Chinese addicts. The opium trade eventually expanded to the USA, which has its roots with the Chinese immigrants of the 1800s. Chinese immigrants came to work on the railroads or as miners of the gold rush and brought the habit of opium smoking with them. Opium dens sprang up in the Chinatowns of San Francisco and New York. Most of the opium den patrons were Chinese, but many white Americans would also enjoy getting high in these establishments. In the 1890s, opium use was almost entirely attributed to Chinese men, and tabloids published stories of white women being seduced by Chinese men and their opium to invoke fear of the yellow peril. The opium dens in San Francisco and New York were usually controlled or protected by the Chinese benevolent organizations known as Tongs. Although the organization itself is legitimate, many of the Tong members were full-fledged gangsters, which led some to believe the Tongs were criminal organizations. Tongs like the Hip Sing and the On Leong warred with each other for decades over control of criminal rackets. The Tongs used their connections in China to smuggle opium to be smoked, and they had a monopoly on this for the late 1800s and early 1900s. Things started to change in 1909 when Congress passed the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, which banned the possession, importation, and use of opium for smoking. However, opium could still be used as a medication. This was the first federal law to ban the non-medicinal use of a substance. This, in turn, created the illicit trade, which attracted many underworld figures. After China overthrew their monarchy and became a republic in 1911, the Green Gang from Shanghai became a dominant force, and gangsters like Du Yuesheng made a fortune off of the opium trade. The Republic of China's ruling party, the KMT, used opium as one of its main sources of income in order to finance its military excursions. The Green Gang's opium began to be shipped into the USA. U.S. officials curbed the trade once again in 1914 by passing the Harrison Act, which heavily taxed narcotics, making it unprofitable for dealers, both legal and illegal. By the early 1920s, opium use was declining due to more government crackdowns, like the Jones-Miller Act. Opium dens in San Francisco were almost completely eradicated. In a public event that took place sometime around 1920, San Francisco police burned confiscated opium in the middle of Chinatown. However, some dens still operated secretly in other states, like New York. The rise of Rothstein and Luciano. Jewish gangsters, who were involved in opium since the beginning in Asia, were some of the first to become heavily involved in getting opium imported into the country through various methods. Jewish gangsters had connections to China and abroad and would even resort to staging heists of legal opiates as they were delivered to hospitals, or they would order in bulk from legal suppliers in Mexico or Canada under fake company names. In this period, Italian mafia members were forbidden to get involved with drugs because of the moral code emplaced by old-school gangsters like Joe Masseria. However, some Italians did not follow this rule, so this left many opportunities for racketeers with big business minds and no moral restrictions. This is where the Jewish gangster Arnold Rothstein comes into play. Rothstein was known as one of the first mob bosses in American history. He is credited with transforming crime from a local street thing into big, organized business. He was involved in everything from bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling, and he was said to be the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. He is also regarded as the first drug kingpin in American history. In the 20s, it was the perfect time to get into the drug business. Not only was the political situation perfect, but it was also the right time socially. Jazz music became popular, and a subculture formed of young drug users. This was also the time of Prohibition, in which alcohol was made illegal by the government, which gave the gangsters a great lift. Rothstein took advantage of the situation and formed contacts with European and Asian sources to get narcotics of all sorts smuggled into the country. He sent emissaries like Sidney Steyer to Europe and Asia to purchase drugs for transport into the United States. Since heroin, cocaine, and morphine were available from legitimate pharmaceutical companies in Europe, he was able to purchase large quantities of the drug for the American market. However, Rothstein was murdered in 1928 while the illegal drug trade was still in its infancy, and he never got to see its full potential. Rothstein's drug rackets were taken over by his Italian and Jewish underlings, such as Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Lepke Buchhalter. Soon after the death of Rothstein, the drug market was again up for grabs. The U.S. government dealt a huge blow to organized crime by ending alcohol prohibition nationwide in 1933. This led some gangsters to realize they needed to expand into other businesses, which led many Jews and Italians back into the drug game. The Mafia-Tong alliance is formed. This brings us to focus on Lucky Luciano. Luciano, who was born Salvatore Lucania, was a Sicilian-born gangster from New York City. He is credited with being the father of the modern Italian-American mafia, since he founded the Commission, which was the governing body of all Italian organized crime in America. Lucky got into the Underworld originally as a student of Arnold Rothstein. Luciano grew up in Manhattan in close vicinity to Chinatown, so he was familiar early on with the Chinese and their business ways. He used to visit Chinese opium dens as a teen to get high. It's possible that the Chinese were his first introduction into the dope game. In fact, Lucky's first arrest was for possession of heroin in 1915. He learned the ropes of the drug business while being Arnold Rothstein's underling and was ready to blow it up for himself. Shortly after the death of his mentor, Rothstein, Lucky became the most powerful Italian gangster in the country and had all the mafia families in America under his rule. After Prohibition was repealed in 1933, Luciano and his Jewish associates established direct contacts with the Chinese. As mentioned in our video about the Green Gang, Jewish gangster Jacob Yasha Katzenberg was sent to Shanghai by the mob to secure a deal with the Chinese in the mid-1930s. Through the Jews of Shanghai, Katzenberg met mob boss Du Yuesheng of the Green Gang, and he began to work for them. Katzenberg helped the Green Gang refine opium into heroin on a massive scale. The gangsters then arranged a massive smuggling operation from Shanghai and Hong Kong into the United States. Lucky Luciano would then use these contacts to start a drug ring of his very own. Lucky needed people in the States already familiar with the dope game to build a massive operation, so his primary target was none other than the Chinese. The Chinese and Italian gangsters always lived in close vicinity to each other, since the two groups immigrated to the country around the same time. However, interaction between the two ethnicities was rare, for they stayed in their own neighborhoods. But this was about to change in the 1930s. Around 1933, Lucky's people discovered that the Hip Sing Tong, which had chapters in several U.S. states, was already involved in dope smuggling across the country. This Tong was mainly based in New York's Chinatown and was at constant war with their rival Tong from the same neighborhood, the On Leong. The Hip Sing Tong at this time was headed by a man named Yi On Lee, aka Haim, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was a seasoned gangster and was implicated as a gunman in several prior Tong wars. Now, under Yi's leadership, the Hip Sing was moving on from Tong wars and was getting more into organized crime. Lucky Luciano had wiped out the older Italians who were against drug sales, and he now had no restrictions and was free to dive into the drug game head first. Lucky linked with Yi On Lee through his lieutenant named Gaetano Tommy Pinocchio. Pinocchio was a well-respected gangster from Mulberry Street in Little Italy and was involved with narcotics for years. Tommy and his brother were made members of the Luciano crime family, which is now known as the Genovese family. Being from Mulberry Street in Little Italy, he was always just a few minutes away from Chinatown and the Tong headquarters, as Mulberry ran through Little Italy into Chinatown. The Italian and Chinese gangsters met and decided that the two groups would collaborate. In these times, smoking opium was less popular, but heroin and morphine were on the rise. The two parties decided that the Italians would smuggle in Chinese or Turkish opium, heroin, and morphine from France into New York, to be resold on the streets in powder or pill form by Chinese dealers. During this era, a kilo of pure heroin could be purchased from its source for 3,000 solen, then diluted and divided into 15,500 500 milligram capsules, and by some accounts, it could turn a profit of $300,000. The operation and the investigation. This was a great opportunity for both parties. The Chinese were now able to expand their old racket into a whole new demographic, and the Italians were able to enter a new form of prohibition. The plan was set for Luciano's lieutenant, Tommy Pinocchio, to receive the shipment of dope in New York's harbor and meet with Hip Sing Tong officials from New York City for the sale. New York was chosen as the best spot for shipments because the New York docks were almost entirely run by the Italian mob. This eliminated much of the risk of the possibility of dope being seized by customs agents, which was a huge concern for the Chinese for years. To avoid the law, the Chinese became experts in smuggling, dating back decades, in which they'd hide drugs in toys, food packaging, and other items. Now, with a connection to the Italians, they had a huge lift. After the drugs arrived, the New York Tong members would then distribute the dope on the streets or get the heroin pressed into pills at local Chinese laundries. The New York Tong members also linked with other Hip Sing branches in the country, such as in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco, to create a nationwide drug ring. The plan was actually successful for several years, with no pressure from law enforcement, and was profiting over $1 million a year. This became the largest dope ring in the country's history at the time, and was the first known time of cooperation between Italian and Chinese organized crime in America. In 1936, Thomas Pinocchio and Lucky Luciano were arrested on prostitution charges and sent to prison. Now, with Tommy in prison, someone needed to take his place. But instead of choosing a fellow gangster, Tommy put his wife, Mary DeBello, in charge of the operation while he was locked up. But eyebrows began to rise as streets across the country were being flooded with a new kind of heroin in the form of red pills that were getting people extremely high. Shortly after the arrest of Pinocchio, law enforcement made their first hint in uncovering the operation. It all started after a petty drug bust in New York City, which led police to find a pill-pressing machine inside a Chinese laundry. The next clue was after a low-level dope user named Charlie Lum was busted in Seattle. Lum was very afraid, which made him a perfect candidate for interrogation. He gave the feds valuable information and led them to believe there was something much bigger going on. The feds decided they needed undercover work to be done to infiltrate the society. But at the time, there weren't any Chinese Americans working for the FBI, so their only option was to use white men. 2 men were chosen for the job, and their names were George White and John Esch. It was a risk to choose 2 Anglo-American men because, as far as the Chinese knew, the only Caucasians involved in the drug trade were Italians and Jews. Agent White made a deal with the arrested Chinese man in Seattle, saying that he would let him go free if he would just show him where he bought his drugs. Lum agreed and brought Agent White to Montana to meet a big shot in the drug game. White's plan was to pose as a dope dealer from San Francisco to earn the trust of the drug lord. Lum introduced the FBI agent to one of the main dealers on the West Coast, an old Chinese man named Chin Jue Hip. Chin was described as someone out of a movie. He used a cane, had a long white mustache, and wore traditional Chinese clothing. He owned legitimate businesses with his son, and was the most well-respected man in the Chinese community of Butte, Montana. But many in town weren't aware of his dark side. He was a huge dope dealer with contacts around the country. Infiltration and discovery. Agent White became friends with Chin and then bought heroin and morphine from him. Chin then arranged for him to meet a prominent hip sing official from New York named Jimmy Wong. Agent White met Wong in New York at a 6th Avenue cafeteria near 42nd Street. Here, Jimmy Wong sold the agent 10 ounces of morphine. Then, much to Agent White's surprise, he was able to infiltrate the highest ranks when Jimmy Wong introduced him to a hip sing leader from Chicago named Ng Yi Song. Then, to the FBI's delight, Song proposed Agent White for membership in the Tong. It was unheard of for a white man to be a Tong member, but it still had to be approved by the leader of it all, Yi On Lee. Yi On Lee was the national hip sing president and the most powerful man within the organization. White was introduced to Yi, and the two became close friends after months of hanging out casually and playing mahjong together. He decided the agent was someone he could trust, and he had Agent White introduced as an honorary Hip Sing Tong member. This was the first time a white man became inducted as a member of any Tong in the United States. White described the initiation ceremony as being blindfolded, with incense burning, in a room surrounded by 60 hip sing members. Then he vowed to steal, maim, or kill if ordered by superiors, and swore that he would burn if he ever revealed the Tong's secrets to outsiders. Agent White became familiar with Chinese customs. He learned the genius of the Tong in that they were not officially a criminal organization. The Hip Sing Tong as a whole was a Chinese benevolent association for the community, and most members were not involved in criminal activity. But at this period in time, a large number of officials formed their own drug syndicate within the Tong and used their association as a shield. Hip Sing President Yi Haim eventually gave Agent White the golden ticket when he wrote letters on his behalf to show the rest of the Tong leaders that he was a white man that they could trust. The Tong leaders were very clever and never explicitly talked about their illegal activities with White, but instead, they talked in code. So Agent White's only hope to build a case would be if he actually purchased opium from all of the hip sing hierarchy. Now with these letters, Agent White was able to meet every figure involved in the dope ring in the country, such as Chicago, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, New York, and Cleveland. White successfully purchased the drugs from all of them to officially build his case. Eventually, Agent White discovered that all the Tong chapters were getting their dope from a hip sing member in New York named Li Fu. White flew out to meet Li Fu in a hotel room. Li also brought his main supplier with him. The agent was shocked to discover that the supplier was not only a non-Chinese but also a female. It was an Italian-American woman named Mary DeBello. DeBello slipped Agent White a note that had her name and an address to meet. Agent White and Mrs. DeBello grabbed dinner together the following day. She started bragging about her mafia family and how her husband is one of the top drug dealers in the country for Lucky Luciano. She also told the agent how the Italians and Chinese formed an alliance to smuggle narcotics. After the dinner, Agent White ran a background check on Mary DeBello, and he quickly realized she was the wife of imprisoned gangster Thomas "Tommy the Bull" Pinocchio. the Takedown and Aftermath. They found out that Mary was acting on behalf of her husband and overseeing drug smuggling from France into the United States. Then, through further investigation, Agent White was introduced to a powerful hip sing named Wong Wai. Wong revealed that his cousin was a smuggler in Hong Kong who worked to get the drugs brought to France. This is when the feds realized this was an international operation with an endless web of networks. Agents eventually met with other players on this operation across the country to buy dope from in order to complete their case. Eventually, some rumors were spreading around in New York's Chinatown that the agents were rats because of their suspicious questions and purchases. Agent White was even pressed by Hip Sing members in New York, but he kept his calm and talked his way out of the situation. Knowing his life was in danger and that time was running out, the feds decided enough evidence had been gathered. After almost 2 years of investigation and over $10,000 of the feds' money being spent on purchasing drugs, they decided that they should act and close the operation. The feds made their move in the November of 1937 and conducted several raids across the country. The raids on Hip Sing headquarters and dope houses led to the arrest of over 30 individuals. Prominent Tong leaders were caught in the raids, like Yi Song and Jimmy Wong. The leader of it all, Yaon Lee, was arrested in the Hip Sing offices in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Also, several Italian Americans and Mafia members were arrested, including Mary DeBello and her brother-in-law, Vito. Various cases went to trial in late 1937, which led to over 17 convictions. The prison sentences ranged from a few months all the way up to 20 years. Jimmy Wong received a 5-year sentence, Yi Song received 3.5 years, and Mary DeBello received 3 years. Hip Sing President Yi Haim's case went to trial, as he was being charged with a conspiracy to run a nationwide syndicate and for selling and possessing narcotics. Agent George White presented recordings of a phone call between him and Haim's wife, where they were talking about the purchasing of heroin. Haim defended himself by insisting that he never mentioned drugs by name on phone calls or in letters, and yet he was still sentenced to 18 months in prison in the February of 1939. The light sentence on Yi can be attributed to the laws of the time, which was before the RICO Act was established, which made bosses guilty of all the crimes of their underlings. After the sentencing of Yi, it was official. The largest dope ring had been destroyed. After Yi's prison sentence, he retired from the Tong life and lived a simple life in the Chinese community of Pittsburgh and was part of many charitable organizations. He died in 1963 at the age of 74 and was survived by his 2 children. Lucky Luciano was never formally tied to the Hip Sing Tong drug case, but law enforcement knew he was involved. Agent George White apparently visited Lucky in prison to interview him in 1938, but Lucky was unhelpful to the agent. After Lucky was released from prison, he became one of the #1 drug dealers in the world throughout the 1950s and 60s. Then, the Italian mob as a whole became the main traffickers of narcotics in America, well into the 1980s. The Tongs in America stayed involved in drug smuggling for decades, and Hip Sing officials were indicted again in 1959 for narcotics smuggling under George W. Yi. They stayed involved in the drug trade well into the 1990s, when they started using street gangs like the Ghost Shadows and Flying Dragons to do their dirty work for them. This is all for this story, and thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please leave a comment and a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us.